I manage projects by following a structured approach. I start with initiation, move through planning and execution, and then close the project out. I make sure all stakeholders are aligned, and I keep the team focused on the deliverables. I am very organized, and I use project management tools to track progress. Communication is very important to me, so I make sure everyone is always on the same page.
And do you know what the hiring manager heard when the candidate delivered that exact word-for-word answer?
I mean, I'm guessing they were absolutely blown away by that profound level of insight.
They heard absolutely nothing. I mean, It is a textbook illusion. The candidate sits there, takes a breath, and feels like they just nailed the question.
For sure. They walk out of the room feeling great.
Right, feeling amazing. But meanwhile, the hiring manager smiled, nodded politely, maybe jotted down a meaningless squiggle on their notepad, and mentally moved right on to the next applicant in the pile.
Because on the surface, an answer like that sounds completely fine. It has the right words, right? Like initiation, execution, deliverables, stakeholders, but it's totally empty.
It is technically correct, completely forgettable, and utterly devoid of any evidence that this person has ever run a real project in their entire life.
Wow.
Yeah, it is the kind of answer you give when you have read a glossary of terms on an internet forum, but have never actually been in the trenches when a project is bleeding cash.
Welcome to part 7 of our deep dive series here on The Critical Path. Today, we are stepping into what is arguably the ultimate crucible of the interview process.
The trapdoor.
Yes, the trapdoor. We are talking about the exact moment where theory collides violently with reality. In our notes and across the industry, this is often referred to as Domain 3, which is just talking about your work.
Right.
Our mission today is to decode the precise frameworks, the specific vocabulary, and the hidden psychological signals that separate the true battle-tested practitioners from the people who have merely worked on projects.
And this is so vital for you, the listener. Whether you are actively prepping for a massive interview tomorrow, or maybe you're sitting down for a performance review next week.
Or you just want to command respect.
Exactly. Even if you simply want to articulate your professional value with lethal precision to your current leadership team, this deep dive is designed to completely rewire how you talk about your daily operational reality.
Because the reality is usually you can talk your way through an interview if you're charismatic enough.
Absolutely.
You can talk about your overall profile, your education, your philosophy on leadership, or like why you want to work at the company. You can reframe your internal motivations to sound incredibly strategic.
Yeah, you can charm them.
But when you hit the phase of the interview where they ask you how you actually do the job, it's over.
It is the great equalizer, because there is nowhere to hide.
No.
The hiring manager isn't asking about your dreams or your personality type anymore. They are going to ask you about specific processes, specific situations,
hard facts,
specific tools you have used. If you haven't actually used them, or if you have used them but lack the vocabulary to articulate them with precision, you will be exposed instantly.
It reminds me of taking a driving test. You can sit in a classroom and memorize the DMV handbook all day long. You can know exactly how many inches you need to park from a fire hydrant, or the exact speed limit in a school zone.
Right, you know the theory.
But at some point, the instructor puts you in the driver's seat of a real car and makes you parallel park on a busy, rainy street with traffic backing up behind you.
That is stressful.
Yeah. You can't quote the handbook while you're scraping the curb. You either know the dimensions of the car or you don't.
That is a perfect analogy. The friction of the real world exposes you. And when we look at the data from hiring managers across the industry, there are two very distinct types of candidates who crash their car during this exact test.
I know exactly where you're going with this. Let's start with the first one.
The first is what we can call the nerd.
The nerd. I feel like everyone knows this person. Top heavy on theoretical knowledge, maybe a wall full of PMP and Agile certifications, but incredibly light on actual, messy, real-world experience.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They pass the questions on motivation with flying colors. I mean, they can draw you a beautiful color-coded diagram of how a project should work in a perfect world.
In a vacuum.
Right, in a vacuum.
Yeah.
But when the hiring manager leans over the table and says, well, walk me through how you handled it when your lead developer quit 3 weeks before go live, they hit a brick wall.
Because that's not in the textbook.
Exactly. Because operational fluency, the friction of real people, real budgets, and real panic cannot be faked.
And then there's the flip side of that coin, The second type of candidate who completely bombs this part of the interview,
Yes.
the dangerous practitioner.
The dangerous practitioner is fascinating because they are the exact opposite. This is the person with a decade of raw in-the-trenches experience, but absolutely zero formal methodology.
None at all.
They have survived their entire career on pure grit, charisma, and 80-hour work weeks.
The hero complex.
Yes, they can tell amazing war stories about saving a project at the 11th hour with a spreadsheet and a box of pizzas.
We've all been there.
Sure, but the moment the hiring manager asks, how do you structure a formal baseline review? They crumble. Their experience is entirely real, but their framework for describing their reality is incredibly weak.
That's it. So the nerd has the framework but no experience, and the dangerous practitioner has the experience but no framework.
Exactly.
Both of them fail. And I think we have to remember why businesses care so much about this, why the hiring manager is being so ruthless. Businesses use projects because projects are expensive, complex, and highly visible.
Projects represent concentrated risk.
Yeah.
That is what you have to remember. The hiring manager isn't looking for a good storyteller, and they aren't looking for an academic theorist.
So what do they want?
They are looking for a safe pair of hands, someone who can take a $5 million budget and a chaotic team of 20 people and introduce absolute predictability.
Predictability. That's the key word. So, to survive this crucible, you need a framework that proves you are that safe pair of hands. From all the sources we've analyzed, we've extracted a way to view your past work through 4 specific structural lenses.
These are game changers.
They really are. These lenses will take any messy, chaotic, real-world experience you have and instantly translate it into a senior, credible, bulletproof answer.
If you master these lenses, no operational question will ever catch you off guard again, because you won't be scrambling to remember what you did. You'll be feeding your memories through a machine that outputs pure competence.
Let's get right into the first lens, the project lifecycle. At a basic level, every project has a beginning, a middle, and an end. That's what defines it as a project and not just an ongoing operational task, right? Like processing payroll is an operation.
Upgrading the payroll software is a project.
Exactly. And between that beginning and end, there is a universally recognized set of phases. You've got initiation, planning, execution, monitoring and control, and close.
Right, but here's the critical shift in mindset that separates the amateur from the veteran.
Okay.
These phases are not just arbitrary hoops to jump through. They aren't just administrative categories. They are financial and operational control points.
Wait, stop right there, because I want to make sure the listener really grasps this. Explain the mechanism there. What do you mean by financial and operational control points?
Think about it from the perspective of the project sponsor, the person writing the checks.
Yeah.
If they are funding a multi-million-dollar initiative, they do not want to hand over full funding on day one.
Oh, of course not. That's terrifying.
It's way too risky. They want control points where they can stop, assess the reality of the situation, and make a go or no-go decision. Do we continue funding? Do we pivot the strategy? Or do we kill the project entirely?
So the project lifecycle is actually an investment protection mechanism.
Precisely. During initiation, the sponsor might release just enough funds to build a business case and a project charter. If the charter looks good at the gate review, they release the funds for planning.
Okay, I see.
If the detailed plan and budget look sound, they release the funds for execution. So when you speak about the life cycle in an interview, you shouldn't sound like you're just organizing your to-do list. You should sound like a steward of the company's capital.
But how do you talk about these phases without sounding exactly like that robotic candidate from our intro? Because if I sit there and say, well, I do initiation, then I do planning, then I do execution, I sound like I'm reading a Wikipedia page.
You avoid the robot trap by attaching hyper-specific, real-world practitioner actions and tangible artifacts to each phase. Let's contrast the textbook theory with practitioner reality.
Okay, lay it on me.
The textbook answer is, during initiation, I define the scope. The practitioner answer, the one that actually gets you hired, sounds like this. During initiation, I run a kickoff session with the steering group, I walk through the project charter, and I secure formal sign-off on the objectives, the constraints, and the initial budget estimates before we move a single inch into detailed planning.
Wow. That phrase alone, secure formal sign-off on the objectives and constraints, carries so much gravity. It proves you understand that without a signed charter, you have no authority.
And you follow it up with a real-world anecdote. You say, on my last major implementation, that rigorous initiation session surfaced 3 massive assumptions the client had that were nowhere in the actual sales brief.
Oh, that happens all the time.
all the time. Catching those unbriefed assumptions at the initiation gate saved us from a catastrophic scope dispute 3 months down the line.
That is brilliant because it explains the why. You didn't just hold an initiation meeting because the textbook told you to. You held it to smoke out hidden assumptions.
Exactly.
And that brings up a really crucial point about how you describe these phases. The way a candidate describes their life cycle instantly broadcasts the true scale of their experience.
Scale is everything in project management.
Right. If a candidate claims to use a formal steering group, a written project charter, and mandatory gate reviews for a 3-week social media marketing campaign, the hiring manager knows they are lying.
Or at the very least, they are so deeply confused about methodology that they are a liability.
Yeah, you'd spend more time planning the 3-week campaign than actually doing it.
Exactly. The phases for a brief 3-week tactical task look completely different from a 12-month global enterprise software transformation. For a 3-week task, initiation might literally be a 30-minute alignment call and an email summarizing the deliverables.
That makes total sense.
If you over-engineer a small project in your interview answers, you prove you lack pragmatism. An experienced interviewer will know within 2 follow-up questions if you are exaggerating the scale of your past work. You have to know which world you operate in and describe the life cycle phases that accurately match the weight of that world.
That transitions us beautifully into the next major piece of the framework. We've talked about the linear timeline of a project. Now we need to talk about the disciplines required to manage that timeline. This brings us to Lens 2.
The knowledge areas.
Right. Now, depending on which institute's framework you follow, there are generally 10 distinct disciplines that a complete professional must own. Let's list them just to get them on the table. We've got integration, scope, schedule, cost, quality, resource communications, risk, procurement, and stakeholder management.
It is an intimidating list.
It really is. 10 massive areas. And the danger is that every single one of those 10 areas is a potential interview question waiting to happen. The interviewer might say, how do you handle a difficult stakeholder? That's area 10.
Yep.
Or walk me through how you build a project budget. That's area 4. So how on earth does a listener prepare for 10 different disciplines without memorizing a textbook?
You use a strategy called the Rule of 2. This is highly actionable. Before you walk into any interview, you must prepare at least 2 real-life, highly detailed examples for every single one of those 10 knowledge areas.
2 for each, so 20 stories.
20 stories.
Yeah.
Not theoretical ideas of what you would do in a hypothetical scenario, but actual historical situations where you demonstrated competence in that specific discipline.
Okay, let's unpack this because I want to make sure the listener knows exactly what to prep. Let's pick a few of the toughest ones and break down what a good example looks like. Let's start with scope management. What is the actual mechanism of managing scope? Because it's not just making sure we do the work right.
Far from it. Scope management is fundamentally about boundary defense. It is the art of defining exactly what is included in the project, and more importantly, exactly what is excluded.
That's the hard part, saying no.
Right. A strong practitioner example of scope management involves the mechanism of a requirement traceability matrix.
A traceability matrix. Okay, explain how that works in practice.
It is a document that links every single requirement the client asked for back to a specific business objective and forward to a specific deliverable and test case.
Oh, wow. So you can trace the DNA of every feature.
Exactly. So when you are in the interview, your Rule of 2 story for scope shouldn't just be, I kept the team focused. It should be, we had a stakeholder demand a completely new reporting dashboard halfway through execution. I used our traceability matrix to show them that this new dashboard didn't link back at any of our signed-off business objectives.
That is so clean.
Right. I explained the impact it would have on the timeline, and we mutually agreed to push it to phase 2.
You proved the mechanism. You used a tool to neutralize an emotional request. Okay, let's look at another one. Cost management. Because a lot of people just think cost management is keeping receipts.
Cost management is about forecasting, tracking at the task level, and understanding reserves. A true project manager knows the difference between a contingency reserve and a management reserve.
Wait, break that down. I think a lot of people use those interchangeably.
A contingency reserve is money set aside for known unknowns. These are risks you have identified in your risk log. You know a supplier might be late, so you allocate budget to expedite shipping if needed. The project manager owns this money.
Okay, so I can spend that without asking for permission.
Exactly. A management reserve, on the other hand, is money set aside for unknown unknowns. Completely unforeseeable events, like a global pandemic disrupting the supply chain. Management owns this money, and the project manager has to formally request it.
That is a massive distinction. If I am an interviewer and I ask about your cost management and you casually drop the distinction between how you utilize contingency reserves versus requesting management reserves, I instantly know you operate at a senior level.
Exactly. You are demonstrating financial literacy.
Let's do one more, and I'll pick the one that I think terrifies people the most. Procurement. Dealing with vendors, contracts, statements of work. What does a good example look like here?
Procurement is a nightmare for a lot of PMs because it involves legal liability. A strong example here revolves around contract types. You tell a story about how you had to choose between a fixed price contract and a time and materials, or T&M contract.
Give me the quick difference for the listener.
A fixed price contract shifts the risk to the vendor. You pay $100,000 for the software, period. If it takes them twice as long to build it, they eat the cost. A T&M contract means you pay for every hour they work. The risk is on you, the buyer.
Got it.
A great interview answer is explaining why you chose a specific contract type. The scope was heavily ambiguous, so I couldn't lock a vendor into a fixed price without them adding a massive risk premium. So I negotiated a time and materials contract with a strict, not-to-exceed cap to protect our budget.
It's so good because it shows you understand the levers of power in a negotiation. But let me push back here. Let me be the voice of the listener who is starting to panic right now.
Go for it.
What if I don't have two examples for procurement? What if I've been a project manager for 5 years, but I've worked in an agency where a completely different legal department handled all the vendor contracts? I have zero procurement experience. Do I fake it? Do I read up on fixed price contracts and pretend I negotiated one?
Absolutely not. Never, ever fake it. The moment you fake an area of expertise, an experienced interviewer will ask a tactical follow-up question. They will say, oh, you used a T&M contract. How did you structure the burn rate reporting with the vendor?
Yeah, and you're caught.
If you made the story up, your eyes will glaze over, you will stutter, and your credibility is instantly, permanently destroyed.
So what do? You just admit defeat.
You frame it as a development priority. Interviews are fundamentally about building trust. If you have a gap, the honesty of the imperfect fit is infinitely more compelling than a fragile lie.
A development priority. I really like that phrasing. How do you deliver that in the room?
You look the interviewer in the eye, you don't apologize, and you say, procurement management is an area I am actively developing. My previous organizations heavily siloed that function into a dedicated legal team. So, while I haven't owned a procurement lifecycle end-to-end, here is how I've partnered with legal to define the statements of work, and here is my explicit plan to close that gap and take full ownership in this new role.
That is so powerful. It shows immense professional maturity. You aren't defensive. You know what you don't know, and you have a plan to learn it.
And ironically, acknowledging that gap often makes the hiring manager trust your claims about the other 9 knowledge areas much more.
Because you proved you're honest. Okay, so we have the 10 knowledge areas. But juggling 10 things in your head during a high-pressure interview is tough. Which brings us to lens 3, the ultimate synthesis of project management, the iron triangle.
Scope, time, cost, and quality. The big 4.
I absolutely love this framework because it gives you a devastatingly effective way to answer the broadest, laziest, most annoying question in the history of interviewing. So tell me, how do you manage a project?
It is a notoriously terrible question, but it is asked all the time. The iron triangle is your 30-second elevator pitch. If you are asked that broad question, you do not ramble. You walk them right through those 4 dimensions, anchoring each point with a specific hard practitioner action.
Okay, let's role play this. Let's demonstrate what this sounds like when it's done right. I'll be the hiring manager. I lean back in my chair, interlace my fingers, and say, we have a lot of complex initiatives here. Tell me, how do you actually manage a project? Give me the iron triangle answer.
I would say I manage projects by ruthlessly controlling 4 dimensions. First, scope or consent. I run a formal baseline review before execution starts, and I enforce a controlled change request process for absolutely anything that comes in after that.
Nice.
Second, time, I build a scheduling model with dependencies clearly mapped, and I run weekly critical path reviews. Third, cost, I track the budget at the task level using earned value metrics, and I have hard rule to flag any variance above 5% immediately. And fourth, quality, I define acceptance criteria directly with the client before we write a single line of code, and we run formal handover reviews at the end.
Boom. 30 seconds. You didn't ramble about your feelings. You didn't talk about being a people person. You delivered surgical strikes. The vocabulary alone in that answer baseline review, critical path, 5% variance, does so much heavy lifting.
It does.
But let's actually explain the mechanisms behind those buzzwords so the listener understands why they work. Let's take critical path. A lot of people throw that term around to just mean the important stuff, but it has a very specific mathematical meaning, right?
Yes, absolutely. The critical path is the longest sequence of dependent tasks in a project plan that must be completed on time for the project to finish by its due date. If any task on the critical path is delayed by 1 day, the entire project is delayed by 1 day. It has zero float or slack.
Right. So if I'm building a house, painting the living room might not be on the critical path because I can do it while the plumbers are working. But pouring the concrete foundation is absolutely on the critical path. You can't frame the walls without the foundation.
Exactly. So when you tell an interviewer that you run weekly critical path reviews, you're telling them that you don't just look at a generic to-do list. You run a targeted analysis of the specific sequence of tasks that possess the power to destroy your deadline. You are managing the physics of the schedule.
And what about the cost element you mentioned? Flagging a variance above 5%. Why is that specific number important?
It proves you established thresholds. Amateur PMs track a budget and only report it when all the money is gone. They just say, hey, we're out of cash.
Yeah, that's not helpful.
Right. A mature PM establishes a threshold like 5% or 10% variance from the baseline, where an automatic escalation is triggered.
Yeah.
It shows the hiring manager that you act as an early warning system, you don't hide bad news, you systematize it.
It proves you understand that vocabulary isn't just jargon for the sake of sounding smart. It's a signal. Yeah. When you use terms like critical path or variance thresholds correctly, it tells the interviewer that you speak the language of the craft.
Vocabulary is proof of citizenship in the world of project management.
Okay, we've looked at the structure with the life cycle, the disciplines with the knowledge areas, and the synthesis with the iron triangle, but all of that is still a bit structural, a bit theoretical. Now we need to get into the blood and guts of the job.
This is where it gets real.
Yeah, what does it actually feel like to do this on a random Wednesday? This is Lens 4, the Day in the Life lens. And from everything we've compiled in this deep dive, this is the ultimate litmus test in an interview.
It truly is. Because the most revealing question you will ever face is simply, describe a normal week as a project manager.
Why is that specific question so dangerous?
Because you cannot answer it from a textbook. A textbook will say, I plan, monitor, and execute. It's abstract. A true practitioner will give you a devastatingly specific rhythm. They will give you a cadence that proves they have lived in the trenches, balancing internal chaos with external expectations.
Let's break down that cadence. What does a real practitioner's week actually look like? Walk me through it, starting on Monday morning.
Okay, a practitioner's Monday is all about setting the board. It's steering group prep and a rigorous weekly schedule review against your timeline. You are sitting alone, looking at what slipped last week, what resources are on vacation this week, and what dependencies are colliding. Monday is for gaining situational awareness.
Okay.
Tuesday is the internal core team alignment. This is crucial. This is where you surface all the ugly issues privately with your engineers, your designers, your analysts. This is where the fighting happens.
The messy stuff.
Exactly. Someone says they can't hit a deadline. Someone else says the requirements are flawed. You get all the dirty laundry out on the table behind closed doors.
Right. You don't want to find that out while the client is listening. So Tuesday is the internal reality check. What's Wednesday?
Wednesday is the client status call. This is where you present the internally aligned, curated truth.
I want to pause here because this Tuesday-Wednesday split is brilliant. Internal alignment on Tuesday, client presentation on Wednesday.
Mm-hmm.
What do you mean by curated truth? Because some people might hear that and think it means lying to the client.
It absolutely does not mean lying. Lying is fatal. Curating the truth means you don't just dump raw, uncontextualized problems on the client's lap.
Okay, give me an example.
Let's say on Tuesday, your lead engineer tells you a critical database migration failed. If you get on the phone with the client on Wednesday and just say, the migration failed, we don't know why, everything is broken, you induce panic.
You become a multiplier of chaos.
Exactly. Curating the truth means you spent Tuesday afternoon working with the engineer. So on Wednesday, you say to the client, the initial database migration experienced a failure rate of 4% due to corrupted legacy data. However, the team has already isolated the corrupted tables. We are running a script to cleanse them overnight, and we expect to run a successful migration by Thursday evening. This will not impact the final go-live date.
That is the difference between a passenger and a driver. A passenger reports the news. A driver reports the news and the navigation plan.
Precisely. So that's Wednesday. Thursday is your formal risk review. You sit down to update the RAID log risks, assumptions, issues, dependencies. You are legally and structurally documenting the conversations from Tuesday and Wednesday.
And Friday.
Friday is the portfolio report going up to the project management office, the PMO, followed by a personal critical path review before you log off for the weekend so you know exactly what fires are waiting for you on Monday.
Let me challenge this a bit, though, because as a practitioner, I hear this beautiful Monday to Friday cadence, and I think, yeah, that sounds great, until a server crashes on Tuesday afternoon and blows up the entire week. How do you reconcile this structured cadence with the reality that projects are inherently unpredictable?
That is exactly the point.
Yeah.
The structure exists because the work is unpredictable. If you don't have a baseline cadence, an emergency on Tuesday destroys your week.
Oh, I see.
If you do have a cadence, an emergency on Tuesday is simply triaged, inserted into the Tuesday internal alignment, communicated in the Wednesday client call, and logged in the Thursday risk review. The framework absorbs the shock.
That makes total sense. The cadence is a shock absorber. So I think we need to issue a direct challenge to you, the listener, right now. If you cannot pull out a piece of paper today and write down your Monday to Friday cadence with this exact level of specific artifacts like schedule reviews and RAID logs and specific stakeholder interactions, that is your immediate homework.
Absolutely.
Do not go into another interview until you can articulate your weekly rhythm.
Because if you can't describe your week, the hiring manager will assume your week manages you.
It's a huge wake-up call. But let's shift gears slightly into a more philosophical but equally dangerous territory. You're sitting in the interview, things are going well, and then they ask the trickiest question on the board: what methodology do you follow?
It is an absolute minefield. And candidates typically fail this question in one of two ways. They either overclaim or they underclaim.
Let's start with overclaiming. What does that sound like?
Overclaiming is saying, I use Agile purely because it is the trendy buzzword, but having absolutely no idea what an Agile framework actually requires in practice. They think Agile just means moving fast, not writing things down, and having a quick meeting every morning.
Which is not what it means at all. Agile has rigorous ceremonies, artifact requirements, backlog grooming. It's highly structured.
Exactly. And the underclaiming candidate goes the other way. They try to sound laid back and pragmatic and say, oh, I just use whatever works. I go with the flow.
Which sounds terrible.
To a hiring manager, I just use whatever works, translates directly to I have no formalized structure, I make it up as I go along, and my projects are completely reliant on my mood.
So to avoid both of these traps, we need to quickly decode the big two: waterfall and agile. Let's start with waterfall. Give me the history and the underlying philosophy, because I think people dismiss it as old-fashioned without understanding why it exists.
Waterfall is the classic sequential, plan-driven approach. Its origins trace back to the manufacturing and construction industries in the 1930s and 40s. It is built for physical, expensive, and complex deliverables.
Okay.
The fundamental philosophy of waterfall is simple. You must define the entire scope up front, because the cost of change later in the project is catastrophic.
Give me a real-world example of where you must use waterfall, where agile would be a total disaster.
Building a hospital. You cannot pour the concrete foundations for a hospital without knowing exactly how many floors that foundation needs to support. To know the floors, you need to know how many beds are on each floor. To know that, you need the entire architectural blueprint finished before day one.
Right.
You cannot use Agile. You can't say, let's pour a foundation for a 2-story building, and in the next sprint, we'll see if the client wants to add a 10-story trauma center. The physics don't allow it.
Exactly. The cost of change in construction is bulldozing a concrete foundation. It's millions of dollars, and that brings us to Agile. How does the philosophy shift here?
Agile comes along much later, really gaining traction in the software world in the early 2000s with the Agile Manifesto.
Yeah.
It is iterative. It is based on short sprints, usually 2 to 4 weeks. It was built specifically because software deliverables are non-physical, and therefore the cost of change is incredibly low.
Right. If you build an e-commerce website and the client decides they want the Buy Now button to be blue instead of green, you just change a line of CSS code. It takes an engineer 5 minutes. It doesn't require bulldozing a concrete foundation.
Precisely. Agile thrives when requirements are ambiguous and expected to evolve. You build a little, show the client, get feedback, and build a little more.
Okay.
But here is the reality check that separates the veterans from the amateurs in an interview.
What's that?
Agile is massively overhyped by people who have never worked in highly regulated, complex environments. Agile struggles terribly to scale when you are dealing with enterprise-wide, heavily regulated hardware and software integrations.
But Waterfall has its flaws too. It struggles with ambiguity. If the client genuinely doesn't know what they want, Waterfall forces them to guess up front, which leads to massive change requests and budget overruns later. So if Waterfall is rigid and Agile struggles to scale, what is the winning answer in the interview?
The gold standard answer is hybrid. But you have to explain it correctly. You can't just say hybrid and leave it there.
How do you frame that answer so you don't just sound like you're hedging your bets? How do you prove you understand the mechanics?
You explain a principal default, and then you explain how you adapt. You say, my default framework relies on waterfall governance because the enterprise projects I manage involve complex deliverables, fixed budgets, and significant sequential dependencies. The sponsor needs to know when it will be done and how much it will cost.
That makes the sponsor happy.
Right. But then you say, however, the methodology must serve the project, not the other way around. So for the software development components within that larger project, I adapt and integrate agile sprints. This gives the development team the flexibility to iterate on the UI, while I maintain a rigid waterfall boundary around the budget and the final go-live date.
That is a masterclass answer, because what it really says to the hiring manager is, I understand that developers need flexibility to be creative, but I also understand that the CFO needs a fixed date to report to Wall Street. You are translating between two different worlds.
You are demonstrating supreme professional maturity. You prove you have a philosophy of work. You understand why a methodology exists, its historical context, its strengths, its weaknesses, and exactly how you bend it to serve the business outcome.
But let's be real for a second. Having a great philosophy is wonderful, but philosophy doesn't deliver the project. People do. And when the project is in the red, when the client is furious, the business doesn't blame the Agile framework. They look for a person.
Always.
Which brings us to the core psychological principle underlying all of this: end-to-end accountability.
This is the single most vital principle of project management, and it is the one that candidates fail the most often. There is only one project manager on a project. It is not a committee. It is not a shared burden.
Right.
There is one person who is singularly accountable from the moment the project initiates to the moment it formally closes. They own the scope, the timeline, the budget, the quality, and the stakeholders.
I think this is a massive trap for candidates because titles are so inflated these days. A lot of people sit in an interview and claim the title of project manager, when in reality, on their last job, they were a subject matter expert or a coordinator, or maybe they just led one specific technical work stream while someone else managed the budget.
And hiring managers will ruthlessly probe this to find out if you were the driver or just a passenger. But the way they find out isn't by directly asking, were you accountable?
Well, no, because everyone would just say yes.
Exactly. Every single person will say yes to that question. They find out by listening to your linguistic strategy.
The linguistic strategy. Okay, break this down for me, because this is where psychology meets vocabulary. How do they catch you?
It is entirely in the verbs you choose. You don't tell them you are accountable. You demonstrate it through your language. Listen to the difference. When asked about a project governance meeting, a passenger says, I attended the steering group meetings. A driver says, I presented to the steering group.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Attended means you sat in the back taking notes. Presented means all eyes were on you.
Exactly. When asked about finances, a passenger says, I contributed to the budget forecasting. A driver says, I owned the project budget. When asked about problems, a passenger says, I saw the escalation go past me up to leadership. A driver says, the escalations came to me and I resolved them before leadership had to intervene.
That is such a subtle but incredibly powerful shift. Attended versus presented. Contributed versus owned, saw versus resolved. It completely changes the power dynamic of the story.
This raises an important question for you, the listener. When you describe your past roles, do you sound like a passenger gazing out the window, watching the scenery go by? Or do you sound like the person holding the steering wheel, making the hard turns?
It's a great question to ask yourself.
True accountability is baked into your language. You cannot fake the vocabulary of ownership. If you are a coordinator, your verbs will betray you.
All right, let's put all of this theory, all of this vocabulary, and all of these frameworks to the test. Let's move into some deep role play. We've got two specific case studies, side-by-side comparisons of weak versus strong answers. I'll play the role of the interviewer, and let's dissect these.
Sounds good.
Scenario 1. I look at your resume and I say, tell me about the most significant project you've led. Give me the typical weak answer first. Let's hear what not to do.
The weak answer sounds like this. Well, the most significant project I led was a large digital transformation for our legacy systems. We had a really tight deadline and there were a lot of stakeholders involved, which made it tricky. It was definitely challenging, but I kept everyone communicating. The team worked really hard and we delivered it successfully.
I am literally falling asleep. It is completely vague. It is just a cloud of buzzwords. Large transformation. What does large mean? $10,000 or 10 million? Lots of stakeholders. 3 people or 300. Tight deadline. 2 weeks or 2 years. It gives me absolutely nothing to anchor my trust to. Now, give me the strong answer. Feed this through the structural lenses.
The strong answer is hyper-specific. The most significant project I led was a CRM migration for our North American sales division. It was an 18-month timeline with a $4 million budget and a cross-functional matrix team of 12 people.
Great setup.
We faced a dual complexity. We had to migrate 15 years of legacy data without a single byte of data loss, while simultaneously navigating a parallel regulatory audit that unexpectedly compressed our timeline by 2 months.
That's real friction.
Despite that constraint, I maintained the critical path, ruthlessly prioritized the backlog, and we delivered the migration within 3% of our baseline budget.
Night and day. As an interviewer, I hear that and I immediately respect you. You gave me the exact scale, 18 months, $4 million, 12 people. You gave me the specific compounding conflict legacy data versus a regulatory audit. And you gave me the hard quantitative outcome delivered within 3% of the budget.
You painted a high-definition picture of your competence. You didn't just say it was hard. You explained the mechanics of why it was hard and exactly how you measured success.
Okay, let's do case study 2. This is my absolute favorite because it happens on literally every single project in the history of the world. The question is, tell me about a time you experienced scope creep. What does the weak answer look like?
The weak answer retreats into generic philosophy. They say, scope creep is always tricky. I believe communication is key. Whenever it happens, I try to document everything and make sure the client and the internal team are always talking so we can avoid misunderstandings and keep everyone happy.
Again, you're giving me theory. You're giving me a bumper sticker. Communication is key. I didn't ask for your philosophy on communication. I asked for a time you experienced an event. How does the strong practitioner answer?
The strong candidate tells a surgical story. They say, I was managing a facility set up for a new regional office. 3 weeks before our hard go-live date, the client sponsor suddenly asked us to add 3 massive flat screens and a dedicated printer station to the lobby.
Typical.
That was classic scope creep. It was nowhere in our signed baseline. I immediately refused to alter the baseline or jeopardize the go-live date.
Wait, I want to interrupt here. As the host and as someone who has dealt with clients, refusing a client directly can backfire horribly. If the client throws a tantrum, you could lose the account. How does the PM actually negotiate that without destroying the relationship?
That is the crux of the answer. You don't just say no and walk away. You manage the boundary. The story continues. I sat down with the client and walked them through the reality of the situation. I showed them the procurement lead times for the screens, which were 4 weeks out, and the complex internal cabling requirements that would require ripping open finished drywall.
Oh, you show them the physical cost.
Exactly. I explained that adding this now would push the entire office opening back by a month. Once they saw the impact, they agreed it wasn't worth the delay. So I successfully funneled their request into a formal post-launch change request. We hit our original go-live date with the baseline scope, and we delivered and installed the screens as a Phase 2 addition 4 weeks later.
That is incredible. As an interviewer, I hear that and think, wow, they didn't panic. They pushed back on the client, but they used data procurement lead times and cabling constraints to depersonalize the no. They protected the timeline, but they still got the client their screens eventually. That is masterful stakeholder management.
The primary takeaway from these case studies is an absolute unbreakable rule for Domain 3. Never answer a request for evidence with abstract theory. If they ask for a time, give them a time, a place, a specific action, and a measurable outcome.
Which brings us perfectly to our final synthesis. We've talked about what to do. Now we need to explicitly list what not to do. This is a rapid-fire breakdown of the 5 failure principles. These are the verbal habits you need to sanitize from your interview vocabulary tonight. Let's hit these one by one. Principle 1.
Principle 1. Answering specific questions with generic principles. We just covered this extensively. If they ask for a story about scope creep, do not give them your philosophy on communication. Give them a specific situation, the friction you encountered, the mechanism you used to solve it, and the hard outcome you drove.
Got it. Principle 2.
Firefighting language. This is a massive psychological trap. Candidates love to describe their past projects as managed chaos, where they brag about how they are always putting out fires and working over the weekend to save the day. They think it makes them sound like indispensable heroes.
But it doesn't, does it? Because if you're always fighting fires, it means everything around you is always burning.
Exactly. It makes you sound like a massive liability. Project managers are not hired to fight fires. They are hired to build fireproof buildings. They're supposed to introduce predictability. If your projects are always on fire, the hiring manager will assume you are the one holding the matches. They will assume your planning phase is non-existent.
Ouch. That is a hard truth. Stop trying to be the hero and start being the architect. Okay, principle 3.
The administrative coordinator trap. Do not sound like an admin. Your job is to deliver a tangible, strategic business outcome, not just schedule Zoom calls, take meeting minutes, and order catering. If your answers revolve entirely around, I set up a meeting to discuss this, or I made sure everyone was on the calendar, you are shrinking your authority.
Right. Focus on the decisions that were made in the meeting and how you drove them. You aren't a calendar manager. You are a decision forcer. Principle 4.
Vague scale. We discussed this with the nerd and the dangerous practitioner. Never use qualitative words like large, complex, tight, or many. Always anchor your credibility with hard, undeniable numbers. What was the exact budget? What was the duration in months? How many people were on the Matrix team? Numbers remove ambiguity and instantly establish your weight class.
And finally, principle 5.
Claiming accountability without evidence. This goes back to our linguistic strategy and the psychology of ownership. Don't use the wrong verbs. Don't say you managed a project if your verbs describe someone who just attended the meetings and watched the escalations fly past them. Own the outcome in your vocabulary. Use verbs like owned, presented, resolved, negotiated, and delivered.
So to bring all these tactical failures back to the overarching theme of this deep dive, Domain 3 is entirely about proving you are a battle-tested practitioner. You aren't just reciting a textbook. You have the scars to prove you've done the work and the structural framework to explain exactly how you will do it again for them.
Knowledge is only valuable when it is understood and applied. These frameworks, the life cycle control points, the rule of 2 for knowledge areas, the iron triangle elevator pitch, the Monday to Friday cadence, there are tools to help you apply your lived experience in a way that the business world instantly respects and understands.
Let's briefly recount the journey we've taken today. We started by exposing the incredible danger of Domain 3, the place where generic answers go to die. We built out the structural lenses to frame any answer. We talked about why project lifecycle phases are actually financial control point.
We covered a lot of ground.
We really did. We explored the deep nuances of the 10 knowledge areas, from requirement traceability matrices to time and materials contracts. We gave you the iron triangle pitch of scope, time, cost, and quality. And we broke down the brutally revealing day-in-the-life weekly cadence, proving the necessity of curating the truth between internal alignment and external presentation.
We decoded the methodology debate, explaining the history of waterfall and agile, and exactly why and how to leverage the hybrid answer to show pragmatism over dogma. We established the absolute necessity of end-to-end accountability, proving you are the driver, not the passenger, through your verbs. And we just sanitized your approach with the 5 failure principles.
Whether you are walking into a massive interview tomorrow morning, or you are just trying to command more respect and authority from your current executive team, these frameworks are your armor. Use them to articulate your value with lethal precision.
There is always more to learn in this discipline. But if you apply the rigorous mechanics we've discussed today, you will never give a forgettable generic answer again.
We want to end with a lingering thought, something for you to mull over as you go about the rest of your day before we pick this up in our next discussion. Think about the very last project you finished. The messy one. The one that took everything you had. The one that kept you up at night.
Oh yeah, we all have one of those.
Exactly. If someone had secretly recorded you describing that project to a friend over coffee, what would they hear? Would they hear the precise, accountable, structured language of a true practitioner who owned the outcome? Or would they hear the chaotic, firefighting, meeting-heavy complaints of a passenger who was just along for the ride? Think about that carefully, because how you frame your past is exactly how people will value your future. Keep refining your craft, and we will see you next time as we dive even deeper into the crucible in Part 8.